Hi, this is David Bedford and welcome back to the next episode in our series looking at the history of the Quarrymen from the very, very beginning. So if you haven't seen any of the first episodes yet, click on the link. You can go and watch those, watch them in the right order, because we're going to do the whole thing chronologically, well, as much as possible anyway. And also, of course, there was the performance of the Quarrymen at Strawberry Field, which I was fortunate to play with them. So you can watch that as well. But today we're going to get into, when did the Quarrymen actually start? Who was playing with them? Where did they first play? Now, the easiest thing is where they first played, which is Quarrybank Hall at Quarrybank School. And we also know that they were formed at Quarrybank School. But when was it? This is the big debate. Now, I've been talking to the Quarrymen, especially to Rod Davis, trying to get together the right sequence of events. When did the Quarrymen start? So we don't know exactly, because none of them were keeping a diary, which I think is quite selfish personally, because they should have known years later we would need to know this information. But let's do what we can. Process of elimination. Most important thing we know is Rock Island Line. So the single comes out at the end of 1955, and by January 1956, Rock Island Line is in the top 10 in the UK charts, the hit parade as it was back then, and it went on to sell 1 million copies. So that starts the Skiffle revolution. What happens after that? Very important person in the story is Jeff Lee. Now, if you did the 12 Days of Christmas videos that we did just before Christmas last year, you'll have seen the story. Jeff Lee, very important part of the story. Now, when I first met the Quarrymen, which was back in 2004, and we were talking about the very beginnings of the group, Eric Griffiths, amongst others, was always saying there was a lad called George Lee who had suggested starting the group, but nobody knew what had happened to him, and nobody knew the story. After Liverpool had come out, which was 2009, I was contacted by George Lee's son. So for the first time ever, and I think I'm the only person to have interviewed him, he told me the story. Now, his name is actually Jeff Lee. He got his name George Lee. Every kid at school has a nickname. Big department store in Liverpool is George Henry Lee. So with his last name being Lee, first initial G, he got called George Lee. And he told me, first of all, a fascinating story. One that John had once cycled down to his house to see if he was there. But John, like all the other kids, just knew him as George Lee. Jeff's mum opened the door and John says, "Is George there?" And Jeff's mum, of course, says, "Nobody called George who lives here." "Oh, okay," says John, and off he cycles. Nicknames, that's how these things happen. But he was a school friend of John's, and he was into the music. And now everybody was talking about Skiffle, everybody was talking about Rock Island Line. And it's Jeff who says to John, "You love the music, why don't you start a Skiffle group?" And so that is what Jeff did. But also, very importantly, Jeff had a guitar which he couldn't play. He lent that guitar to John. So what we're saying is, the very first guitar John learnt to play on was Jeff's. And I went searching to find any corroboration for that. And I found a quotation from John which says, "The first guitar I learnt to play on, I borrowed from a mate at school." That mate was Jeff Lee. So Jeff says to John, "Start a group." And that's what John does. Jeff was never in the group. I think he hung around with them a little bit, but he's the guy who started everything. So big thank you to Jeff Lee for that one. So let's look at, when did the Quarrymen get going? Now, in our Looking for Lennon film, we interviewed Michael Hill. Michael was a close friend of John, of Pete Shotton, Don Beattie. The four of them used to hang out together. And Michael went to Holland on a school trip, Easter 1956. So the Easter was the end of March, beginning of April in 1956. And he picks up the record of Long Tall Sally. This is what Michael remembered.
Now, this was Easter 1956. We had the opportunity to go on a school exchange program to Amsterdam. And of the four friends, as we were then pretty close at Quarrybank, only three of us went to Amsterdam. John Lennon didn't go, and I wish I could tell you why he didn't go. I discovered this record which had only just been released, and I discovered later it was been released about 2 days before. This record wasn't released in the UK for about another 6 or 9 months. And it was Long Tall Sally, Little Richard, just amazing. And the young guy in the shop told us about the record, we played it, and I said, wow. I remember thinking, wait till John Lennon hears this record. I put this on, I told John, I said, I've got a record here, but that immediately got John's attention. So they're all quiet, put the record on. And this was on a good radiogram with a very good bass, and it was thumping out. Nobody at home, so I had it on loud. So we all look at John, waiting for him to say something, really keen to have his reaction. Absolutely stunned. He didn't know what to say.
So importantly, what Michael remembered was that soon after John had heard Long Tall Sally, he got a guitar and started the Skiffle group. So it doesn't make sense that it was the end of 1956 that they started. We've got to be looking towards somewhere around post-Easter 1956. Now, knowing it was Quarry Bank Hall they first played, we know there was a dance in the October 1956. Now, Rod has spoken to many Quarry Bank Hall boys, and there's one in particular who had this poster. Now, this guy, Eddie Martin, he helped to organise this dance, and he says that he introduced the Quarrymen, which included John and Pete and Eric and Rod and probably Bill Smith. Now, that dance says that's March 1956. Now, that seems very, very early. So, what do we know? What can we prove? Well, we can say that the Quarrymen were definitely formed in March or April or May or June or July 56. Yeah. But what do we think is the most likely? I think from the evidence we've got here, April, May 56 sounds right. The March 56 dance, that sounds a little bit early, but we can't say for definite. What we do know is that sometime before the end of that summer school term, the Quarrymen had started. Now, again, in our Looking for Lennon film, we interviewed Bill Smith. This is what he remembered about the very beginning of the Quarrymen.
I don't know what the date was, but it must have been early in 1956. John Lennon, Pete Shotton and myself had a little meeting outside the woodwork room with the idea of forming this Skiffle group. Now, John Lennon had the guitar that he didn't know much about playing. Pete Shotton had nothing, so he said, okay, well, the washboard will do you. I said, I'll supply the bass, because I'd been to the jazz clubs in town and knew all about Lonnie Donegan and the Skiffle group using a tea chest for a bass. I said, right, I will get the bass, because there was plenty in the school. What are we going to call it? I said, the Quarrymen, because we're at here, Quarry Bank High School. John Lennon said, no, he didn't like the idea. Pete Shotton said, oh, you know, John, sounds okay. So he said, all right. So that was a Quarrymen. So later that afternoon, when it was all quiet, I zipped into the woodwork room, looked around, nobody here, grabbed the tea chest and away down this little back lane. John Lennon, Pete Shotton, Eric Griffiths and myself, Bill Smith. And that was the original 4 Quarrymen.
So that's it. Bill says they got going. It was the 3 of them, John, Pete and Bill. Eric soon joined. So the first lineup is John Lennon, Pete Shotton, Bill Smith, Eric Griffiths. And they got their instruments all sorted out. Of course, Rod Davis joins soon after. So that's our Quarrymen getting started. So what we'll do next is we'll have a look at each of those musicians, each of those people in profile. And we can see how the Quarrymen become a Skiffle group. So join in next time. Don't miss an episode. Make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And we'll see next who were the members of the Quarrymen.